This week, we're showing another topic which I needed for the chat app, which is to allow the user to select a photo from their photo library. Now, before we dive in, just a quick reminder that we do have a CWC ideas board, and I'll link to that in the video below. And that's a place where you can vote for your favorite topic ideas or submit ones of your own. All right, with that said, let's dive in. All right, so before we jump into Xcode, I want to give you an introduction of the two different classes that we can use to facilitate selecting from the photo library. Now, the good old trusty one is called UIImagePickerController, and this one provides a UI for the user. So you don't have to build any custom UI. It's going to lay out all of the user's photo library images in a grid-like fashion for them to select something. And furthermore, with this class, you can also choose the source, whether you want to choose camera, which is actually going to launch a viewfinder so the user can take an image and then you'd get a reference to that image that the user took. So you could do something with it, or you could choose the source for this picker controller to be the photo library, in which case it would display all the images in a grid. Now, this one has been around for a while, so you can see iOS 2.0. It's been used a lot. It used to be sort of the de facto solution. And also, this is a UI kit class. So just in case you're new to SwiftUI, UI kit used to be the old user interface framework. Nowadays, we're fully, at least for us teaching, and Apple's, future looking prospects, they're going with SwiftUI. So, over time, things will gradually shift towards SwiftUI, but for now, there are still a lot of useful classes in UIKit, and a lot of companies are still using UIKit because there's a lot of apps and things that have been created prior to SwiftUI. So that means that we are going to have to use this UIKit class inside a SwiftUI project. And if you've never done that before, it's going to be a little bit confusing, but I'll take you through it. So don't worry about it. There is a newer class called PHPickerController. And this is in the PhotoKit framework, but essentially it's still sort of like a UIKit thing. You'll see the availability is iOS 14 and above. So it's actually a lot newer. And you can see here some of the benefits of using this: deferred image loading and recovery UI, more reliable handling of large and complex assets, and things like that. But I'll tell you why I'm still using the UIImagePickerController. And that is because there are still bugs with this. Even here, currently, while we're recording this is iOS 15. So, I ran into some of these issues while first recording this demo, and I found in the developer forums that I feel like this is a pretty big problem, that the PHPicker, you can't select PNG images from it. People are running into problems, and this was asked a month ago, and this bug is still present, and this was only 2 weeks ago. And, seeing that, I don't want to work with this right now, just because it doesn't seem production ready. Especially if you read this thread, there are some apps that are already in the App Store. They have users, paying users, and the app owner upgraded to this new PHPicker View controller only to find out that these bugs exist. And, you're going to have a bunch of unhappy users. So for now, we're going to stick with the UIImagePickerController. All right. With that being said, let's jump into Xcode and let's start this project. All right. So we are now going to start a new Xcode project. So under iOS, select app. We're going to call this image picker demo. Interface is SwiftUI, language is Swift, and let's save this in drafts. Okay, I'm not going to create a Git repository. Just going to do that. And for this basic UI, let's change that to iPhone 13, and I'm going to put a button here, and this button is going to say upload. So the label is going to say, not upload, but like select a photo. And the code is going to show the image picker. Now the way we're going to do this is through a sheet. So we are going to, I'm actually going to put this button inside a VStack because when we retrieve the photo from the photo library, I want to show that image. So I'm going to put that image above the button. So I'm going to just create a VStack right now for that. And then I'm going to put the sheet modifier on the VStack. Now, this has a couple of different things. So, for example, there is a binding to a Boolean state property, which dictates whether or not this sheet is presented. And if you've never used this modifier before, a sheet is basically a view. Think of it as a view that's going to slide up. So this state property, this Boolean state property, is going to dictate whether or not that view is currently showing. So why don't we go ahead and create a state property up here. And we're going to say show picker. Initially, that's going to be false. And we're going to pass that state property as a binding here. Yeah, maybe this one is picker showing instead. Okay, so binding is using the dollar symbol. All right, so this one on dismiss. So when this view is dismissed, do we want to run some code? So I'm not going to run anything for that. So I'm going to put nil. And then for content, this is what you want to display when this turns true. So in other words, this is what you want to display. And you can put a block of code in here. So I'm going to double click that to open up a new closure. And inside here is going to be my image picker. So what do you think I should do when the user taps on this button? Well, I'm going to toggle that to true. Not toggle, because toggle is something else. I'm actually going to set it to true. And what that's going to do, because this is a state property, it's going to trigger all the view code that is depending on that to recalculate. So when I set this to true, this is going to be true, and then it's going to show whatever I have in here. All right, so that's simple enough. The next thing we want to do is actually create the image picker. So as I mentioned before, the class that we're going to be using is UIImagePickerController. Now remember the fact that this is a UIKit class, and it's also it's a navigation controller, UI navigation controller. And this navigation controller is actually just a UI view controller. Okay, so there are actually two different ways for us to work with UIKit classes and views. So let me show you the way in which we can work with UI view controllers, which is what this image picker is. So we're going to go back here and we're going to create a brand new class. Let's call it Swift file. Create a new Swift file, and let's call it image picker. Create. Let's put this right here. And we're going to import UIKit because that's where the UIImagePickerController class is in. We're also going to import SwiftUI. So what we're going to do is create a new struct called ImagePicker, and we have to conform to this protocol called UI view controller representable. And this is sort of the bridge that is going to bridge that functionality between a UIKit class, which is what this is, to a SwiftUI project. So that was UI view controller representable. Now don't be confused, because there is also a UI view representable. So that's not what we're doing here, because UIImagePickerController is actually a UI view controller. So the one we actually want to conform to is UI view controller representable. Okay, so essentially we're representing this UIKit class as a SwiftUI view. Now there are two different functions that we need to implement to conform to this protocol. One of them is make, and the other one is update. So make UI view controller, let's put that in there. And the other one is update UI view controller. Now, if there's nothing to update, we don't really have to add any code in here. This one is the more important one because this is where we're actually going to create an instance of the UIImagePickerController and return it to use in our SwiftUI view. So let's make one. Let ImagePicker equal UIImagePickerController. And there's just a couple of things we need to set here. Source type equal, now we're not going to do camera for this demo, we're going to do photo library. Now notice that it says here photo library for this, using the UIImagePickerController to select from the photo library is going to be deprecated in a future version of iOS. They don't tell us which version in the future, but it will be removed in favor of the PHPicker, which is what got me looking into this. But since it's still really buggy, we're going to stick with the UIImagePickerController for now. Okay, so going back here, it'll still let us select photo library. It's just warning us. Okay, image picker like that. And then we are going to return the image picker. Let's Command B to build this, make sure everything builds. All right, build succeeded. Let's see if this is going to work. Coming back to content view, this sheet modifier, we are going to create an instance of that class that we just created. And let's give this a run and see what happens. Okay, so select a photo. All right, well, we get some UI. This is great. So by default, the simulator does have some photos. Selecting one is also nice because it automatically dismisses it. That's great. Cancel also does the job. Now, we don't have any code right now to detect which image the user has selected. That's what we have to add now. If you've never worked with UIKit protocols and delegates before, this may be a little bit confusing, but that is the pattern in which UIKit classes communicate to other components of the app. So let's walk through how we are going to detect events from the UIImagePickerController. Essentially, we need to detect the event where the user has selected an image. So the way this works is the image picker, well, essentially the UIImagePickerController class has a property called a delegate. And when the user selects a photo, the image picker is going to contact the delegate and call a very specific method. And it's going to pass through the photo that got selected through that method. So in this property, this delegate property, we need to assign it, I guess you could call it a receiver, someone like an object to receive this event. All right, so you can see here that there is a very specific type, data type of the type of object that you can assign as the receiver, as the delegate. In other words, you can't just assign any object to receive that information. So we're going to have to create another class down here that is of that specific type that can receive those events. So we can assign that as the delegate. All right, so hopefully that makes sense, right? We're going to need to assign this to something. Object that can receive image UIImagePickerController events. Okay, so we have to create a class of that type right now so that we can assign it as the delegate. And that way, when the user actually selects an image, it's going to contact our object and we can write the code to do something. So down here, we are going to create a class. We're going to call it, let's call it, in the tutorials and all of the Apple documentation, they call it coordinator. So that's what I'm going to stick with as well. So class coordinator, and this coordinator class has to conform to a couple of different things. Well, first of all, we have to specify the type of this class is going to be NSObject, and this is sort of like an old Objective-C UI kit type thing where it gives this class all of the functionality of being an object. Second of all, this coordinator class has to conform to 2 different protocols in order to be assigned as the delegate here. So first of all, it needs to be assigned as the UIImagePickerController delegate. And conforming to this protocol basically gives our coordinator class the ability to handle those methods from the UIImagePickerController class. Next, we need to also conform to the UINavigationController delegate, because if you look at here, you'll notice that the UIImagePickerController is a UINavigationController, and this basically allows a couple of UI view controllers to work together, so you're able to navigate between them. So you'll notice in this UIImagePickerController, when it popped up on the simulator, you notice that there were a couple of different views. Like we could toggle to the albums view, and we can see a couple of different views. And so the UIImagePickerController really is a UI navigation controller that probably contains a couple of view controllers. So we also need to conform to the UINavigationController delegate in order to handle those methods. All right, so this is our class. And now inside of this coordinator class, we can handle the methods that this image picker would call when the user has selected something. So let's say image picker controller. So there's this one, did cancel. So if you want to run some code, run code when the user has canceled the UI, the picker UI. Here's your opportunity to do that. But the one we're more interested in is this one right here. Image picker controller did finish picking media with info. And inside this info parameter, you'll see this is a dictionary. And this dictionary is going to contain our image data. So let's go ahead and add this method that we're going to implement here. Run the code when the user run code when the user has selected an image. So what's going to happen is when we create an instance of coordinator and we set it to the delegate here. So for example, now this is not what we should do. I'm just showing an example. Let's say we create a new coordinator object and we assign it to delegate. So when the user either, cancels something or finishes selecting the photo, it's going to contact the receiver here, the delegate, which is our coordinator, and it's going to call these 2 specific methods depending on what happens. So that's how that communication is going to work. Now we can't actually just create a coordinator and assign it as the delegate. It doesn't work that way. With this UI view controller representable, there is something called the context that you'll notice here, right? And the context has a coordinator property, right? The view's associated coordinator, right? So this property, what it's going to do is it's going to create an instance of this class down here, and it's going to assign it to the delegate. Now, you're going to see an error right here. You cannot assign. What it's really saying is that it doesn't know how to create that coordinator. It doesn't know that we want this class, which we've called coordinator, to be, to be this one right here. So what's going to happen when we try to assign context.coordinator to the delegate is that it's going to try to create one. It's going to try to create a coordinator, but it doesn't know what to create. So we have to implement the method called makeCoordinator. And when it tries to access this, it's going to call this. And then in here, we can implement the code to tell it how to make the coordinator. So we're going to say return a new coordinator object. And so let's change the return type here. to coordinator, like that. All right. Now, what we're going to do is set a breakpoint just to make sure this works. So let's say print image selected. Print canceled. So we should see these two statements printed in here. I just want to double check that the image picker is calling its delegate and calling these two methods. All right, so let's run the app right now, and then we're going to try it out. So first of all, let's cancel out of it. We'll hit cancel. Oh, you'll see cancel right there. So that's awesome. The other thing is that when we select an image, you'll see image selected. So this is great because this tells us that hooking up all this stuff has worked. We can actually detect the events that are happening. Now notice that we've sort of lost, because we're actually handling it manually now, we've lost the ability for this to dismiss. That was sort of free functionality. Now we're actually going to have to implement it. All right, so but that's not going to be too difficult. The question now actually is, how are we going to get the image, which we're going to have right here, back to the content view? Right? Because in this content view, what I want to ultimately do is have an image here, and I want to display the selected image above the button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a state property right here called selected image, and this is going to be a UI image, and initially this is going to be nil, and we are going to try to display that. If selected image is not nil, then we will display that. And I'm also going to make this resizable, and I'm going to set it to 200 just so we can see it. Yes, I can force unwrap this because I already checked that it's not nil here. So I'm gonna run this, and obviously we won't see that image. There's nothing here. But ultimately what I want to do is when the user selects a photo, I want to assign the selected photo to this state property so that it will immediately be shown. I can't even dismiss it now, but it'll be shown right above the button. So what we're going to do is pass this selected image as a binding through to the image picker, and then we are then going to pass a reference of the image picker through to the coordinator, so that when we get down here, we can assign the image to that binding and it sort of travels all the way back up. But it's easier to show you than to explain. So let's try this out. Here I've created that state property to store a reference to the selected image. Inside the actual image picker, I'm going to create a binding called selected image, and it's going to be of the same type. And then this changes how this is initialized, right? So I have to pass through the binding for the selected image. So I'm going to use the $sign to represent a binding. I'm going to pass through this state property as the binding. So now inside of the image picker, if you take a look at right here, I still don't have access to that binding. And the reason is because this is the coordinator class. It's completely different from this image picker structure where we declared the binding, right? But how we're going to get access to this in order to set the selected image is inside the coordinator here. Like we're going to pass it through the initializer. We're going to pass through a reference to the image picker through this initializer and then store that here. So we're going to create a property called var parent, and this is going to be of type image picker. And then in the initialization method, so this is going to get called when we create a coordinator, I am going to I'm going to request that a reference to an image picker be passed through. And then I'm going to say self.parent, which is referring to this, equals parent. Or maybe I'll call this picker just so it's a little more clear. Okay. And then when we create an instance of coordinator, we're going to have to pass through self. So what's happening here is when the image picker creates a coordinator, it's passing a reference of itself through. And then, here we are saving that reference to our parent property here, so that when we come down here and the user has selected an image, we have access to it, to self.parent.selectedImage equals, and then we can set it to the image. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say, in order, I told you that the image is in this info dictionary, right? So info, and there's a very specific key for the image data, for the UI image, that is. So, and it's UIImagePickerController.InfoKey.OriginalImage, original uncropped image selected by the user. So that is the key that we're going to pass into this dictionary, and we're going to retrieve it. See, the data that gets retrieved is any, because it doesn't know, right? But we know it's a UI image, or at least we hope it is. So just to be safe, you can use optional binding. You can use an if statement. We're going to use optional binding if let image equals that. So if it's not nil, it's going to get assigned to image. And then inside these brackets here, we were able to get the image, and we can say self.parent.selectedImage equals image. Now there is a problem here, because as soon as we do this, it is going to be affecting the UI, and we should always be changing the UI in the main thread and not a background thread, right? So we are going to use dispatch queue main.async in order to run this code on the main thread, and passing it back. And yeah, so hopefully you can see how this works. Let's test it out, and then we'll just recap the code again. There is still one more part we need to do, which is dismissing the photo viewer. Okay, so that's right. We can't actually see because we're not dismissing it just yet. All right, we gotta implement the second part, which is dismissing it. So you know how we already have the state property isPicker showing equals false? Well, we might as well pass that through as well to the image picker, and then we can just set this to, false if we want to dismiss it. So why don't we go ahead and do that? In the image picker, I'm going to create another binding, var isPicker showing. This is going to be bool, and then inside back in content view here, we're going to add that second parameter, and this is a binding $ to the isPicker showing close bracket. All right, so now back in image picker, we have a reference to this boolean, and that means that we also have that here. Now we can dismiss the picker. Now regardless of whether or not I was able to retrieve the image, I still want to dismiss it. That's why I'm putting it outside of that optional binding if statement right there. Here we're going to say parent.isPicker showing equals false. Right, we're going to do the same thing here when the user has canceled. Okay, now let's take a look at this. Everything should be working. Select an image. There we go. Awesome. Everything is working perfectly. So if this is your first time, learning about protocols and delegates, and how the UIKit classes communicate back out through calling very specific functions or methods, then I would suggest that you review this video again. That is if you are planning to work with some UIKit classes. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any specific questions about this, be sure to post in our Code Crew forum where myself or someone from the team will jump in to help. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.